Long before the first sword was raised, long before the first wolf howled across the frozen plain, the end had already been written. In the oldest chambers of Norse cosmology, beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree whose branches hold the 9 realms in trembling suspension, there existed a prophecy that not even the Allfather could unmake. The Norse did not fear Ragnarök the way lesser traditions fear annihilation. They named it, they studied it, they prepared for it with the solemn discipline of those who understand that knowing one's fate and surrendering to it are entirely different things. This is the story of how the cosmos ends, and why that ending matters. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, opens with a voice summoned from the edge of death itself. Odin, the Allfather, greatest of the Aesir gods, descended to a crossroads beyond the world's rim and raised a Völva from her ancient grave. He needed to hear what the dead alone could see. She spoke without mercy. She described what she had witnessed at the dawn of creation, the wars between gods, the suffering of the bound trickster, and finally, the terrible sequence of events that would unravel every thread of existence. Odin listened. He had always known. But hearing it spoken aloud by the lips of a dead woman made it immovably, irrevocably real. At the heart of the Norse cosmos stood Yggdrasil, the immense ash tree whose roots drink from 3 wells, the well of wisdom, the well of fate, and the spring of Mjölnir, seething with serpents. For ages beyond counting, the great tree endured. But even Yggdrasil was not immune to the slow corruption of approaching doom. The Eddas tell us that Nidhöggr, the corpse gnawer, an enormous dragon of incomprehensible age, perpetually gnawed at the deepest root. Squirrels carried insults between serpent and eagle. The bark rotted in places. The branches groaned. The Norns, those 3 ancient weavers of fate at the tree's base, worked their spindles without rest, not to prevent what was coming, but simply to record it with perfect, unhurried accuracy. When the end truly begins, it does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, on the wings of cold. Fimbulwinter, the great winter, would be the first undeniable sign. 3 successive winters without a summer between them. Snows driving from every direction at once. The sun weakening, retreating, becoming a pale memory behind walls of ice. The Norse understood winter not as a season, but as a living adversary, a force that consumed livestock, starved settlements, and dissolved the bonds that held communities together. Multiply that by 3. 3 years of biting dark, of frozen rivers and failed harvests, and you understand what Fimbulwinter truly meant. Not merely cold, the systematic unraveling of civilization itself, the stripping away of every comfort that separated humanity from the wolves. Fimbulwinter does not only kill through cold, it kills through desperation. The ancient texts are grimly specific. Kinship would shatter. Brothers would raise axes against brothers. Fathers and sons would tear apart the oaths of blood that had governed Norse society since memory began. The Eddas describe it with almost clinical precision, a world in which the moral order dissolves as completely as the physical one. No war declared by kings, no border dispute, no ancient grievance would drive this slaughter. Only hunger, only fear, only the particular madness that visits those who have watched their world freeze to death and found no gods willing to intervene. This social collapse was, in many ways, more terrifying than any monster, because it required no beast, only men and the extremity of their suffering. Even before Fimbulwinter descended, One of the crucial pieces of Ragnarök had already been placed. Deep within the earth, in a cavern sealed with the entrails of his own murdered son, the trickster god Loki lay bound. His crime, engineering the death of Balder, the most beloved of all the Aesir, the god of light and purity, whose loss had driven Odin himself to inconsolable grief. The gods had chained Loki to 3 sharp rocks. Above his face, a serpent dripped venom endlessly, and Loki's wife Sigyn held a bowl to catch the poison, emptying it again and again. When she turned away to empty the bowl, the venom struck, and Loki's agony shook the earth. That, the Norse explained, was the origin of earthquakes. Beneath the world, a fury older than storms waited for its moment. But chains, however ancient and however strong, are not eternal. As Fimbulwinter deepened and the moral order of the world continued its collapse, the bonds that held the trickster snapped. The Eddas do not linger on the moment, perhaps because it needs no elaboration. The earth shook, the cavern split, and Loki, furious beyond measure, soaked in centuries of humiliation and venom pain, walked free into a world already dying and perfectly suited to his darkest intentions. He would not stand with the Aesir in the final battle. He had loved them once, or something like love, something complicated and double-edged. That was finished now. He would captain the ship of the dead and sail it toward the walls of Asgard, because some wounds do not heal and some betrayals do not permit reconciliation. Loki was not the only prisoner of the gods whose chains would not survive the end. His monstrous son, the wolf Fenrir, had been bound with Gleipnir, a ribbon-thin magical fetter forged by the dwarves from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Nothing that exists cannot be undone by the same forces that created existence. As Ragnarök approached, Gleipnir stretched. As Fimbulwinter deepened, it frayed. And when the ribbon finally snapped, Fenrir opened his jaws so wide that his upper jaw scraped the sky and his lower jaw dragged the earth. And the howl that erupted from his throat was the sound of every nightmare that had ever been deferred finally arriving. In the depths of the world ocean, coiled around the roots of Midgard itself, the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, Loki's other monstrous child, had slept its patient, terrible sleep. It had grown so vast that it could encircle the entirety of the earth and bite its own tail. Now, as the final age began, Jörmungandr released that tail. It thrashed. The oceans exploded outward in walls of black water, drowning coastlines, swallowing low-lying lands, erasing the work of centuries in minutes. The violence of the serpent's awakening was not merely physical, it was cosmological. The boundary between sea and land was one of the fundamental structures of the Norse world. When Jörmungandr rose, that boundary ceased to exist. The sea had always been waiting. Now it collected everything it was owed. From the shore of Nastrund, the corpse strand, the most wretched shore in all of Hel's domain, a ship set sail. Naglfar, the great ship of Ragnarök, was constructed from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the human dead. The Norse believed that trimming the nails of corpses was a sacred duty precisely because of this. Every uncut nail contributed another plank to Naglfar's terrible hull. When the ship launched, it carried a crew of the drowned and the dishonored, the unnumbered armies of those who had not earned a warrior's death. Loki stood at the helm. The ship sailed not toward any earthly harbor, but directly toward the walls of Asgard, black against a sky that had forgotten what sunlight looked like, its sails filled with the breath of the ending world. At the edge of Asgard, where the rainbow bridge Bifrost arched over the void, stood Heimdall, watchman of the gods, the one who required no sleep, whose hearing could detect grass growing in the fields of Midgard and wool growing on sheep across the 9 realms. He had watched. He had always watched. And now, with Fenrir's howl still echoing between worlds and the black sails of Naglfar visible on the horizon of existence itself, he raised the Gjallarhorn to his lips. The sound that erupted was not merely a warning, it was a summoning, a vibration that traveled through every branch and root of Yggdrasil, reaching the ears of every god, every Einherjar warrior in Valhalla's feasting halls, every creature in every realm. The call had been dreaded for an age. It had finally come. In the great golden hall of Valhalla, the Einherjar, the chosen dead, warriors who had fallen with honor and been carried to Odin's hall by the Valkyries, had trained for exactly this moment for centuries. They had feasted on endless mead and endless boar. They had fought each other at dawn and healed at dusk and risen to feast again. Every wound closed, every death reversed. This was not merely reward, it was preparation. When Heimdall's horn reached them, 540 doors of Valhalla opened simultaneously. 800 warriors poured through each door. A host beyond counting assembled on the Asgardian plain, and at their head rode Odin, spear in hand, ravens on his shoulders, one eye burning with the weight of every secret he had ever purchased with suffering. From the south came fire. Surtur, the black giant who had stood guard at the border of Muspelheim since before the gods themselves were born, advanced at the head of an army of flame. His sword was not a weapon forged in any earthly forge. It blazed brighter than the sun itself, a blade of absolute conflagration that would, at the last, set fire to the world entire. The Eddas describe Surtur as ancient beyond reckoning, older than Odin, older than the Aesir pantheon, a primordial force from the time when creation was nothing but fire and ice grinding against each other in the void. He had waited with the patience of geological time. Now he walked, and where his footsteps fell, the earth itself ignited and did not stop burning. On the plain of Vigridr, vast enough, the texts tell us, to host all the armies of all the worlds, the final battle erupted. The noise of it would have been indescribable, the clash of divine weapons against primordial monsters, the screaming of worlds tearing apart at their seams. Odin rode straight toward Fenrir, the Allfather who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom and hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days to earn the runes, who had shaped and guided the fate of the world for an age, drove his great spear Gungnir directly at the wolf's open throat. He knew what was coming. The vulva had told him. He rode forward anyway, because knowledge of fate and the courage to meet it face forward were 2 entirely different things, and Odin had always possessed both. Gungnir struck true, but Fenrir's hide, stretched across a frame grown to devour worlds, absorbed the blow the way the ocean absorbs a stone. The wolf's jaws closed. Odin, the Allfather, the Wanderer, the god of wisdom and war and poetry and death, the architect of human civilization as the Norse understood it, was swallowed whole. The silence that follows this moment in the texts is, in its own way, more devastating than any description could be. The death of Odin is the death of a father, the death of a teacher, the death of the intelligence that had, however imperfectly, imposed meaning on the chaos of existence. For a single suspended moment on the plain of Vigridr, everything faltered. Then Vidar, the silent god, the son of Odin, stepped forward. Vengeance, like fate, keeps its appointments. Elsewhere on the field, Thor, the red-bearded thunder god, the protector of mankind, the one who had fished Jormungandr from the ocean and nearly pulled the Midgard serpent free before the giants intervened, faced his ancient nemesis at last. Mjölnir sang through the air in terrible arcs. The serpent's venom filled the sky like black rain. Thor struck the killing blow, driving his hammer through the serpent's skull with the force of all the storms he had ever summoned combined. Jormungandr died, and in dying, released one final exhalation of venom. Thor took 9 steps. 9 steps backward from the body of his ancient enemy, the same body he had circled since the world's beginning. On the 10th step, the son of Odin and the earth fell, poisoned, to join his father in whatever comes after gods. With the great gods fallen, Surtur fulfilled the final clause of his ancient purpose. He raised his blade, the sword brighter than the sun, and swept it across the face of creation. The 9 worlds caught fire. Yggdrasil, already weakened by centuries of gnawing and the shock of so many divine deaths, began to burn from its deepest roots. Its branches, which had cradled the 9 realms through all the ages, became pillars of white flame. The seas boiled, the mountains crumbled, the sky tore. Everything that the Norse cosmology had described, every realm, every creature, every carefully maintained structure of divine and mortal existence, was consumed by Surtur's fire in a conflagration that was not merely destruction, but a kind of terrible, absolute completion. The world fulfilled its prophecy and was released from it. Then, silence. The Norse did something extraordinary with their apocalypse myth that sets it apart from nearly every other tradition's vision of the end. They did not stop at destruction. The Voluspa continues beyond the burning. After Surtur's fire has consumed everything, after the seas have swallowed what the flames left behind, the ocean slowly recedes. The earth, scorched and bare, rises again from the water, new, green, impossibly fresh, carrying within it the memory of everything that came before and none of its corruption. The silence that follows the end of all things is not the silence of nothingness. It is the silence of a world exhaling after an age of accumulated sorrow, preparing to breathe in again. The Norse gods understood something that purely pessimistic cosmologies do not. Destruction without renewal is incomplete. In the reborn world, not all was lost. The surviving gods, those whose fates had not been sealed in the prophecy, gathered on the plain where Asgard once stood and found the golden game pieces of the ancient gods scattered in the grass, like artifacts of a buried civilization. Baldur returned, the beloved god of light, murdered by Loki's scheming before Ragnarök even began, rose from Hel's realm along with his blind brother Hjudr, who had unknowingly been the instrument of his death. They were reconciled in the new world, where old wounds no longer required their ancient bleeding. The gods spoke of what had been and marveled at the cycle they had lived through, not as prisoners of a cruel fate, but as participants in something vast and purposeful, a story so large it required the death of everything to reach its proper ending. The Norse vision of Ragnarök has endured for 1,000 years, long after the faith that birthed it was displaced, long after the last Volva laid down her staff and the last skald fell silent in his mead hall. It endures because it speaks to something undeniably human, the recognition that all things end, that even the greatest powers are temporary, and that courage is most meaningful not when victory is guaranteed, but when it is impossible. The warriors of Valhalla trained for a battle they would lose. The gods rode to Vigridr knowing the prophecy. They went anyway. In every hall where the old stories were told, this was the lesson carried in the ashes of the gods, that the measure of a life is not found in its survival, but in whether, when the horn sounded, you answered. The world ends. The world begins again. It has always been so.